You know, a little rain never killed nobody. It did break cameras, though. In photography, there's a few issues that I would really consider to be divisive. APS-C versus full frame is definitely one of them. There are a plethora of different opinions out there, ranging all the way from full frame is dead to APS-C is only for amateurs or outright bad. This argument can feel especially frustrating when you are new to photography trying to buy your first camera. You don't want to go out and spend your money on something that you don't need, but at the same time, you don't want to go out and spend your money on something that's going to give you bad results. What I'm hoping to do with this video is to show you what the actual differences are between these two formats, and allow you to make the decision that best suits your needs based on that. But that's enough of an intro. Let's get into this. For anyone who doesn't know, APS-C and full frame refer to the size of your camera's sensor. Full frame being the larger of the two, measuring roughly 36 by 24 millimeters. It's called full frame because it's roughly the same as 35 millimeter film. APS-C, on the other hand, is a crop size sensor, meaning that it is a decent amount smaller than full frame. To my knowledge, every camera manufacturer makes their APS-C size sensors a little bit differently, but on average, they're about 23.5 by 15.6 millimeters. Because APS-C size sensors are smaller, this creates what we call the crop factor. When you crop an image digitally, you're essentially zooming into a photo. When using an APS-C size sensor, you can almost think of it like it is zooming in for you at the sensor level. Most APS-C size sensors have a crop factor of 1.5. Meaning that if you have a 50mm f2 lens, that will then be the equivalent to a 75mm f3 lens. And yes, the crop factor does apply to the f-stop as well. Well, hold on a second, because that's not entirely true. It is true that we multiply the crop factor by the aperture when we are wanting to determine the equivalent amount of background blur that we're going to get in a photo. However, we do not do this when we are wanting to determine the overall actual amount of light that is going to be exposed to our sensor. Let me give you an example. We're going to take two photos. One with an APS-C f1.2 lens, and then with a full frame f1.8 lens. We can see that when we take this photo at f1.8 on both lenses, that they are exposed the same. However, the f1.8 on full frame has slightly less in focus, and by that has more background blur. But when we open up the APS-C lens to f1.2, we can see that we actually are getting the equivalent amount of background blur on that lens with more light entering the photo as well. So it results in an overall brighter image with the same amount of background blur that the full frame image gets at f1.8. One way to see this is that APS-C images give you less background blur for the same lens. Another way to see this, however, is that APS-C actually gives you more in focus with a brighter lens. Neither of these are truly better than the other. They are different, however, and understanding this key difference between these two formats is essential to understanding really the rest of this conversation. And I'd argue 75% of this conversation comes down to this one key difference. Anyway, let's get back to it. So now that we understand this, what are the practical differences? To answer that, let's introduce our two cameras. Representing full frame, we have the Sony A7 II, a 24 megapixel camera, and representing APS-C, we have the Sony A6000, another 24 megapixel camera. Both of these cameras are older, but I actually think that's going to play in our favor for understanding the inherent differences between these two sensor types and where a lot of stereotypes have come from. Image quality is a vague term, but for our purposes, we are going to describe this as the overall level of detail in an image, as well as how much we can push these two sensors with dynamic range and ISO. There were a few stereotypes that I had going into these tests, and all of them really revolve around the APS-C camera being worse than full frame. First, APS-C sensors have worse dynamic range. Second, APS-C sensors have worse ISO performance. Third, APS-C sensors have a worse overall level of detail in their images. and fourth APS-C size sensors are cheaper. Let's go over these 4 different stereotypes that I had one by one and address each of them, starting with dynamic range. A very simple way of describing dynamic range is that it is the amount of light that your sensor can capture in between pure black and pure white. Having more dynamic range ultimately means that you're going to be retaining more information in your highlights and your shadows. To start off with, let's look at a photo that I think has poor dynamic range. You can see that in this image, as we try and lift up the shadows and bring back detail, it starts to fall apart, with a large amount of grain entering our photo, as well as an overall lack of quality. So now that we have a baseline of what kind of bad performance looks like, let's switch over to our Sony cameras. I took the same shot on both cameras and purposefully underexposed. When we pull them back up in Lightroom, I think that we see decent performance out of both of these cameras, but with a slight lead going to the full frame camera. It may have been true that at one point full frame sensors vastly outpaced APS-C, but in my experience, APS-C sensors have dramatically improved. Now let's move on to the level of detail between these two cameras. For this, once again, I took the same shot on both cameras with the same settings and the same lens. Staring at both of these images for some time, I came to the conclusion that yes, the full frame camera does seem to have a better level of detail than the APS-C. When zoomed in to about 500%, the APS-C size sensor has what I can only describe as being a goopy texture to it, especially when you look at the edges of the leaves. Is it this massive difference that some people claim it is? No, I don't think it is, but ultimately I'll let you decide. Let's now compare this full frame camera versus a newer APS-C camera. Taking the same image on both of these cameras does give us very similar results, however, with a much better showing from APS-C. In the end, I'll let you decide which of these you like more and whether or not you think that there is a massive difference between these two images. Next up, when it comes to ISO performance, I think both of these images mostly speak for themselves. Both of these images, of course, again, taken with the exact same settings with the ISO of 12,800. While both of these images are fairly grainy, I must say again that I prefer the full frame image. Even when zoomed all the way out, I just don't think the APS-C image holds up to the full frame. But once again, how do both of these compare to a newer APS-C camera? When comparing against our full frame, the newer APS-C camera definitely puts up a much better fight, giving what I personally think is a better looking image. That's also something really interesting when I've been going through these tests and especially comparing both of these cameras against a newer APS-C camera, is that APS-C cameras, in my experience, are at or exceeding where full frame cameras were 5 to 10 years ago. The gap that was there, that at one time was huge, is now getting smaller and smaller and smaller to the point where it's harder to even tell a difference anymore when you're comparing a modern APS-C camera to a modern full frame camera. I don't think that there is no more difference. I do think one is still there, it's just getting harder to spot. And that takes us to our last point, which is price. I feel like price for these two types of cameras at this point has two distinct different categories. The first category is that you're buying the absolute best that both of these different systems have to offer. And the second is you're buying used or older gear. Because prices change all the time, I'm not going to draw direct comparisons between, say, a Fujifilm X-T5 and a Canon R5. Because knowing the camera market right now, next week, these two will be entirely different. I want to make a few statements that I think will be true regardless of when you are looking to buy. If you are looking to buy the absolute best that full frame has to offer and the absolute best that APS-C has to offer, you are going to spend more money getting the full frame setup. $6,000, $7,000, $8,000. The portion where this gets more difficult is when we're talking about buying older or used gear. When we add that to the equation, this gets much harder because you may be able to find an older full frame camera at a discounted price than a newer APS-C camera. And as I mentioned before, I think older full frame cameras are about where APS-C cameras are right now. And that's where this conversation gets difficult. This is where I'd have to recommend comparing again individual cameras rather than the actual sensor type, unless if what I mentioned about the crop factor or these inherent differences turned you off to one sensor over the other. Price is an area overall where I feel very mixed because, again, like I mentioned, if you're buying a brand new one, yes, the stereotype holds true. Full frame is more expensive. But again, with the wonderful used market that's out there and now over a decade of both of these different camera systems being out there and wonderful cameras coming out along that way, it is much more difficult. The last point that I want to stress with this video may actually be a weird one, but I think if you're looking to get into photography, it matters a lot. And that's that this conversation doesn't actually matter a whole bunch. The differences that we've been talking about throughout this whole video are differences that you are really going to be in a specialized area of photography if you're going to notice them or if you're going to need them. I would argue that the vast majority of people are not in these situations where they're blowing their images up to 40, 50, 60 images, zooming in 200%, and then are always shooting with ISO 12800. If you fall into that category, then full frame might inherently be better for you. But if you're not in that category and you don't think that you're going to be in that category in your photography career, then I think it's really a toss-up, and it's not something that you need to stress over. I can guarantee that with both of these sensor types, you will be able to take amazing images, given that you invest in the right lenses. It's very important to remember that buying the right lenses for your given camera systems matters equally, if not more, than buying the physical camera body. But I think that's about it for me. So thank you so much for watching. If you liked, maybe subscribe. And yeah, have a great day. God bless.